on to the Kingdom Plantae. Alright, so we're still in biological diversity. You probably think you're never going to get out of this unit, right? Alright, well, we're going to briefly go over Kingdom Plantae only because, guess what? Your next unit is all on plants. Yeah, I bet you're looking forward to that. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about it. I'm going to go through some of these things kind of, I'm not going to say quick, but not as intense as we're going to go into next unit. So, Kingdom Plantae in general, multicellular, eukaryotic. By the way, multicellular, many cells. Eukaryotic meaning, guess what? Okay, they have nucleus. They have their specialized cells, unlike prokaryotes. Cell walls are made of cellulose, store food in the form of starch. All plants are autotrophs, okay? They produce their own food by photosynthesis. That's a big thing. We as humans, we're heterotrophs. We don't produce our own food. That'd be pretty cool if we could, you know, like just somehow make a hamburger in our stomach, but no, we're not that cool. Plants, on the other hand, they are, okay? They make their own food. They make their food in the form of glucose, okay? They are non-motile. They can't move. Although they do have movement, they can't get up and walk away, okay? So they're non-motile. Plants are loosely organized into 4 groups based on the presence or the absence of vascular tissue and seeds, okay? So I want you guys to remember that. They're based on 4 groups, and we're going to talk about those briefly, but then we'll actually get into that more when we talk about that in the next unit. Okay, so FYI, plants divided into 3 groups, and I said 4 main groups, but you're going to hear 4, you're going to hear 3, so it kind of depends on what sort you're talking about. But let's talk about these 3. Green algae that live in water, okay? So that's one of the main groups, okay? Very basic form of your plant. We also have non-vascular plants, those that have no tissue that conduct fluids and nutrients, okay? So basically, when I think of non-vascular plants, if they don't have these ducts for, you know, like say, for instance, trees have to get nutrients all the way to the very top, that's a vascular plant. But a non-vascular plant, such as like moss, which I'll get into a little bit more, they don't have to move anything up a great distance, so those are non-vascular. Vascular plants are those with tissues that conduct the fluids and nutrients, so pretty much any other plants, which we'll talk about. Alright, let's go into the green algae. Most are unicellular, okay, so that means these green algae are just one cell. A lot of these form colonies, okay, so green algae you'll see in colonies. A very few of them are multicellular, so that's why most of them, I say, are unicellular. They can live in fresh and salt water, and they can also live on land and in damp places, okay, so they're kind of very versatile. Very closely related to green plants. Probably because they're green. No, in general, green algae are kind of the archaic plants that, you know, so to speak, they've been around for a long time, but they are very closely related to, you know, the green plants that we know of, okay? Still more in green algae. They come in many different forms. Aha, so you've got different, basically different types of algae in the form of different shapes, kind of different functions, okay? Some can be unicellular or multicellular. I'm going to say that again because it's very important. And then usually, why am I repeating this stuff? Okay, I need to delete this one. Okay, so I don't know why I'm repeating this again. I guess I haven't, maybe when I was making this slideshow I was like delirious. Okay, but they are usually found in colonies. A colony is a group of cells that live together. Maybe I really needed to like emphasize those things. Alright, that's going out of here. So I wanted to show you guys this because this kind of breaks down plants in general. So you have plants, a very general term, right? But then you have aquatic and you have terrestrial. Aquatic meaning plants that live in the water. You have terrestrial, that are plants living on land. So basically aquatic, there you have it. Your plants that live in the, you know, sea, the oceans, that can be algae, that can be different types of water plants. But your terrestrial plants, they're broken down into non-vascular and vascular, which we briefly touched on. Then that breaks down into, the vascular breaks down into seed and seedless. The seed plants break into Angiosperms and Gymnosperms, and then the Angiosperms break down into Monocots and Dicots. We're going to go over all these lovely terms, okay, so you're going to know what those mean. This is something I'm not going to talk about a lot. We will go over this again in the plant structure unit, but this is kind of a confusing thing. So I'm going to let you guys kind of read through this. I'm not going to go into much detail because I will talk about more in the next unit, and I will not test you on this, okay, for this unit. You will be tested on it next unit. But the life cycle of plants is not necessarily complicated, but it looks complicated, okay? And when we talk about these terms, I don't want you guys to be like, what the heck? So maybe if you want to tune me out just a little bit, you can, but at the same time, try to let some of this stuff sink in, because next unit you'll start to understand a little bit more. So we call this an alternating cycle of both haploid gamete stage, which is called the gametophyte, and the diploid spore stage. When you think of the haploid and diploid is basically 2N or 2 cells. Haploid is N. You're basically halving that. So you guys got to keep those terms in your mind. Diploid, you're going to see it signified by a 2N. Like that makes sense to me, you know, writing in the air magically. Haploid will just be signified by an N. Okay, it's half of that. So this cycle is known as the alternation of generations. So sporophytes produce haploid spores through meiosis. Now you guys did learn a little bit about meiosis in biology A, hopefully. But meiosis, division of the chromosomes, basically the cells are halved, the number of cells in meiosis. Remember, mitosis produces the same amount of cells, identical reproduction. But meiosis, you have this genetic exchange and you half the number, okay? So basically, sporophytes, they're going to produce haploid spores through meiosis that can grow without any fertilization. So that's what happens with sporophytes. The spore grows into a gametophyte that produce male and female gametes, which are the sex cells, okay? Just like humans have sex cells, the sperm and the egg, so do plants, okay? They can fuse together and develop into another sporophyte. So I've got a picture to kind of show that. And again, if you don't get this right now, that's okay. We'll go over it again, okay? Remember I told you haploid is going to be signified as the N, diploid 2N. So basically, let's start from the zygote. Sometimes it's the easiest place to start. You have a zygote, which is 2N, so that's a diploid. Undergoes mitosis, okay? Mitosis produces that exact replication of this, you know, basically this 2N cell. So you have the sporophyte, which is a multicellular diploid cell, 2N. But then from here, the sporophyte is going to undergo meiosis, okay? So you're going to have this genetic exchange, but it's going to be halved this time. So now you have haploid spores, so signified by the N. Undergo mitosis again. So now you have this gametophyte, multicellular haploid. Mitosis is going to produce an identical, basically, you know, set of those. And you have this other gamete here that forms with this gamete, fertilizes. Oh, hello. Didn't want to do that. Fertilizes and goes back to the zygote. Okay? So let that sink into your little noggin. Hopefully you guys can get that next unit. Okay? Land plants. Some of the land plants. Embryophyta. Crazy name for land plants, right? It's kind of interesting. Why not just call them plants on land? But no, Embryophyta. Embryophyta. Okay, so those are kind of, that's the general term for the plants that have kind of become on land. I told you I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the non-vascular plants. So again, like the mosses that you see, now this is a real close-up version, but you guys have seen it on rocks and such. Liverworts, hornworts, these are what we call Bryophyta. Those are some non-vascular plants that you could see around. So I know some of you guys might be nature freaks, kind of like me. If you guys are ever on a hike in the woods, take a look, see if you guys can find some of these. Not just the mosses, but these cool liverworts and hornworts. So non-vascular plants have no vessels, okay? No roots, no stems, no leaves. So again, your examples I've showed you. Some moss here that we see often, especially in damp places of the forest. Because again, if it's a dry area, it's not going to have enough water and it's not going to be able to basically nourish that plant. So it's usually in very wet, damp places. Non-vascular land plants use diffusion and osmosis to transport materials through the plant. So remember, diffusion is going from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So if you have a higher concentration of water in the soil, which is like a damp area, it's going to move to a lower concentration, which would be that moss or whatever that non-vascular plant is. So that's how they get their nutrients. They're pretty small in size. Sometimes you have large, you know, kind of areas of it, but nonetheless they're pretty small in size, and they grow obviously very close to the ground, in very shaded and moist areas. Okay, the tracheophytes, which are the vascular plants. So tracheophytes have vascular tissues. We call that xylem and phloem. And again, we'll touch on that a lot more in the next unit, okay? But that allows the plant to grow much taller because basically you can be able to get this water up to, the leaves and the stems and so forth, okay? The means of production in these vascular plants are typically spores, okay? So certain things like ferns, club mosses, horsetails, different things like that, they reproduce by spores. But a lot of plants that are vascular have seeds, okay? So these would be the flowering plants, aka gymnosperms, and the conifers, angiosperms, and the conifers, which we refer to as gymnosperms. So vascular plants, they have vessels to transport that food and water. Again, the xylem and phloem. They also have roots, and they have stems, and they have leaves, just like we are used to seeing, right? So examples are pretty much everything you see. Grass, corn, trees, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Vascular tissue is made up of xylem and phloem cells. Xylem carries water and minerals to the leaves, where phloem transports food. So basically that sugar, that glucose, that is synthesized within the leaves throughout the plant, it's transported through the phloem in order to get to all the different all the different areas of the plant so that it can be nourished itself. And it's kind of cool when you see celery. If any of you guys eat celery, you'll notice that you can actually see these little xylem and phloem tubes, okay, the vascular portion where these things flow through the entire plant, okay? So it's kind of cool. Some of those you can actually see the tubes. Seedless plants such as ferns have a vascular system, but they reproduce using spores. So it's kind of cool. Some of you guys have seen ferns, maybe you have them in your house. These are seedless plants, but they still are vascular, okay? So basically they have the xylem and phloem tubes, but they reproduce using spores, which isn't necessarily the most typical. I'm not going to say that one is more typical, but seeds we are more familiar with. But spores, if you guys have ever noticed on the bottom of a fern plant, you'll see these crazy little dots, and I'll show you a picture of them coming up next. But basically, spores, this is their means of reproducing. So basically, under the underside, you have these spores, and they will start to drop off, or somehow they fall off and they reproduce. So it's just showing this, and I'm not going to get into this in depth because you're not going to be tested on this. In college biology, you'll have to know all these terms, but at the same time, they will basically start to form an embryo, these little spores, okay? So again, there's kind of some meiosis and, I shouldn't say there's not any meiosis and mitosis because these are spores, but they will form this embryo, and then again, they will form this, full plant as time goes on. So we'll get into that a little bit more next unit as well, but just understand that these little things that you see under the leaves, those are the means of reproduction, which is kind of crazy to think about. So just these little things you've noticed, yeah, you're touching all the reproductive system of the plant, so you better watch out. Just kidding. Okay. All right. Seed producing. So we talked about the spore, the seedless plants basically that reproduce by spores. Okay. Well, seed producing, obviously, they reproduce with seeds. Okay. There are two main groups for seed-producing plants. The gymnosperms, which basically make up the conifers and such relatives, so cone-bearing plants that have exposed seeds on their scales. Okay, those are the gymnosperms. The angiosperms, on the other hand, are the flowering plants. Those have a protective reproductive structure within the flowers. Okay, they also have adaptations to increase the likelihood of reproduction. So two different types of seed-producing plants, the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So seed plants, when we talk about angiosperms, they have seeds that are not enclosed, okay? They are naked. Ooh, naked seeds. Cone-bearing plants, which basically the seeds are growing on the cones. They have needle-like leaves, okay? And they usually stay green all year round. So we have a lot of these up in our woods, right? I live kind of up in the foothills, so we're surrounded by gymnosperms. And they are typically wind-pollinated. So basically when the wind blows, these cones can fall off, the seeds can fall off. Also birds can start pecking at them, and they will aid in the reproduction with these seeds that are basically not protected. Okay. Let's talk real quick about what is a seed, though. A seed is a multicellular structure containing an embryo and a food source. So a lot of times, if you guys have ever, cracked open a bean, you can even see it with a peanut. If you crack open that peanut, you can see kind of that little embryo. Gross, right? You're eating embryos? Ugh. Okay, just kidding. But nonetheless, there is an embryo that's in there and a food source. The embryo consists of an immature root, an immature shoot, and 1 or 2 seed leaves. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that because that comes into play when we talk about what we refer to those, depending on if there are 1 or 2 seed leaves. Seeds have a hard protective structure that usually can survive without water for years. Okay, so they're made to withstand crazy different things because obviously we're trying to get, not we're, but the plant is trying to reproduce and fight against the odds. Okay, so they can also be carried great distances by animals such as birds and so forth, squirrels and such. Okay, so angiosperms are the most successful group of plants. Okay, they have co-evolved with insects to improve pollination, which is really cool. So because of the insects and because of their existence together, they definitely have kind of had this microevolution over time where they work together. And so the plant is easy access for the bee or the insect, and obviously then it makes it easier for the insect to pollinate those different flowering plants. Okay, they do have flowers, obviously. Seeds are enclosed. They're usually in a fruit. Okay, so typically when we're talking about angiosperms, they're enclosed within the lovely things that we eat, fruit. Most are pollinated by birds and bees. Oh, the birds and the bees. Yes. Okay, they have finite growing seasons. So basically grasses, tulips, oaks, dandelions, those things can just constantly grow. Okay, they'll come back. Some of them, like take for instance tulips. Those are perennials, so those will come back every year. Other things like dandelions, same thing. Grasses, same thing. They will constantly keep growing regardless of the season. Okay, divided into 2 main groups, and this is what we're going to talk about: the monocots and the dicots. Okay, so by the way, here are the seeds that are enclosed within a fruit here, but sometimes in the flower they're enclosed within the flower, but usually that then turns in. So think about when, if any of you guys have apple trees, they blossom, okay, and after the blossom is when the apples start to grow. So these seeds in here turn into the fruit. Kind of cool, right? Okay, so dicots versus monocots. So dicots, I wanted you to remember we talked about the 2 seed leaves versus 1, okay? In a dicot, remember di always stands for 2. So the big thing is there are 2 cotyledons or seed leaves, okay? Another term for that is the cotyledon. In a monocot, mono meaning 1, there's only 1 cotyledon or seed leaf. So if you were to ever crack open a seed and you were to see kind of 2 little seed leaves, you would know that you're looking at either a monocot or a dicot. Okay, sorry, there's some weird dead, dying fly. It's not dead, it's dying. And it's like, yeah, I'll just keep teaching. With dicots, usually there's 4 or 5 floral parts, okay? Or multiples of these, okay? So you'll always know that if you can count the leaves, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, you're looking at a dicot. Where with a monocot, there's usually 3 or multiples of 3. So you're going to see like 3 or 6 or so forth, okay? With dicots, usually there's kind of a veiny looking, like a net-looking network of veins, okay? When you look at a leaf, you can see the veins in it. And if it's all kind of crazy, looks like a, net, that is going to signify a dicot. Where a monocot has the veins running very parallel and long, okay? And a couple more things. Basically, it says 3 pores or furrows. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but another big thing is with a dicot, the vascular bundles, so the xylem and phloem, they are usually in a ring, so they're very kind of symmetrical. Where in a monocot, those vascular bundles are kind of distributed all over the place within that plant, okay? So big differences between monocots and dicots. And I say big, I mean they are minute, but they are distinct in ways that you can actually see. So the monocots, basically, just a quick review, the angiosperms have 1 seed leaf or a cotyledon, parallel veins, 3-part symmetry, okay, fibrous roots. So the roots are very fibrous. They kind of spread out through, a great distance. So an example of some monocots would be lilies, onions, corn, grasses, wheat. Notice if you guys were kids, if you guys were kids, how about when you guys were kids, and you picked grass and sometimes it's really hard to pull out, it's because that root system is very fibrous and it spreads out over, a great distance. Okay? And the vascular tissue is scattered as well. It's not symmetrical in this round little shape. The dicots have two seed leaves or cotyledons. The veins on the leaf are very looking like a net. Okay? Flowers have 4 or 5 parts or multiples of. And they have taproots. Okay? Taproots are like these big, thick roots. Some examples would be trees. Okay? Ornamental flowers where basically it has a bulb on the end. That's kind of a taproot. And vascular tissue is arranged in a ring, just like I had said. So the success of angiosperms basically transport gametes over great distances. That's why angiosperms are pretty much the most abundant, because basically reproduction is a lot easier because the transporting of gametes over great distances happens with animals and insects and so forth, and wind. So there's a lot more variety and obviously a lot easier way to reproduce. Efficient dispersal via fruit, obviously. Tough water-resistant leaves for survival in very hostile environments. Okay? And then pollination, and we're almost done. So birds obviously are attracted to red flowers and bright flowers. Bees can see, hello, don't want to do that. Bees can see colors that humans cannot, which is interesting. I can't even remember why I put that in there, but it's interesting that bees are such a vital part of pollination. I watched an awesome documentary on bees, and I can't even remember the name of it. Maybe it was just called Bees. I need to remember that. Because it's an amazing documentary on how a lot of honeybees are just kind of crazily disappearing, and that it really could absolutely rock our world when it comes to food sources and crops, because bees have such a huge role in that. Okay, moth-pollinated flowers are white and bloom at night. So just kind of some little FYI things, kind of crazy, right? All right, problems living in a terrestrial ecosystem. Terrestrial meaning on the land. So basically support. In the water, the plant is held up by the water, right? On land, a support system is required. So sometimes, things that grow really tall require a huge support system. And that's not always an easy thing, but nonetheless, that's one of the problems living on land. And obviously drying out is a big thing. Leaves are covered by a waterproof outer layer called the cuticle, which is very good because obviously we don't want leaves to dry up, but they could eventually. Opening in the leaves called the stomata allow the passage of gases for photosynthesis, but they can be closed when it's too warm so that not all this water is evaporating out of the leaves, which is really kind of cool. So obviously they need these little, stomatas, these little openings in the leaves for the CO2 to leave, right? Because that's one of the, the oxygen to leave, because that's one of the products of photosynthesis, but it also needs to take in CO2. But it can close off sometimes when it's either too cold or too warm. Gymnosperms have very narrow leaves to kind of minimize that water loss. So that's another thing that happens on land, is just drying out in general. Okay, so I am done. You guys have had enough of me, but you'll hear more about plants in the next unit. So until then, you'll see me next time. I bet you're so excited. Bye-bye.